Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is episode number 77 of Pop Culturally Deprived, and today we're going to be talking about Braveheart on your They May Take Our Lives, but They Will Never Take Our Freedom podcast. I'm Mandi, Kaye.
And I'm Alan.
So this week, Alan is joining me in Matthew's place while he's still off gallivanting somewhere after his wedding. Alan has been on the show before, way back when we talked about Dead Poets Society last year. So welcome back to the show, Alan.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm excited to talk to you about one of my favorite movies from when I was in high school, which we're about the same age. So I really need to know how you managed to not see Braveheart.
Well, Braveheart came out in 1995, so I was 13. And I was really much more interested in watching movies like Clueless and Casper and Jumanji that all came out that same year. And probably the only kind of drama type movie that I really watched that year was Dangerous Minds. I don't know why that was the one that I fell in love with. I think it was because it was Michelle Pfeiffer. But I was definitely more into like Clueless and Casper and Jumanji. So Braveheart was something I looked at with kind of disdain. It was like, I don't wanna watch that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can actively remember, I remember actively saying I don't want to watch that movie.
Yeah, Dangerous Minds is a great pick, though, if you're going to watch one dramatic movie from that year. And actually, Mel Gibson is in Casper. I don't know if you remember that. For like a second, he's in it.
I saw that when I was looking up his filmography, and I don't remember it. Mm-hmm. Because really all I remember about Casper is Christina Ricci and Devon Sawa. So
yeah, because that's the whole thing. I think somebody turns into him for like a second. That movie is chock full of weird cameos, actually. Like Dan Aykroyd's in it and a whole bunch of people. Yeah, Casper's weird.
Yeah.
But we're talking about Braveheart.
We are talking about Braveheart. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the movie?
All right. Like you said, Braveheart debuted in 1995, and it was written by Randall Wallace. I wonder if he's related to William Wallace. Not related.
He's not related.
And it was directed by Mel Gibson, who was also the star, William Wallace, in the movie. So that's always tricky. I always have a lot of respect for people who do that. Like Clint Eastwood will direct and star in a movie. I don't know how people do that, but I'm always impressed by it. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won 5, including Best Picture and Best Director. And it has an estimated budget of around $75 million and grossed over $210 million worldwide. So pretty successful movie, both critically and, like money-wise.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that about him starring in the movie because that was the only way he could get it made. He wanted to make this movie so badly, and the studios didn't want to do it unless he agreed to star in it too, because he was, 1995 was kind of peak Mel Gibson.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting.
And that was the only way they would let him make it. They would fund it, so.
I had no idea about that.
That's why the 20-year-old William Wallace is really 40 years old in Braveheart.
That's true. That it does make that love story at the front end really weird. That he's like, I just came back. He's just like, man, you've been gone for almost 50 years. How does anybody remember you?
Right?
That's funny. Well, when I was looking up all that stuff, IMDb had a pretty good synopsis. It says for people who didn't get a chance to watch the movie yet or haven't, don't remember from way back in the 90s when they saw it. William Wallace is a Scottish rebel who leads an uprising against the cruel English ruler, Edward the Longshanks, who wishes to inherit the crown of Scotland for himself. When he was a young boy, William Wallace's father and brother, along with many others, lost their lives trying to free Scotland. Once he loses another of his loved ones, William Wallace begins his long quest to make Scotland free once and for all, along with the assistance of Robert the Bruce.
I'm really curious if the person who wrote that had ever seen the movie, because I'm pretty sure, at least in the movie, he didn't do anything with the assistance of Robert the Bruce except get captured.
Right.
So I think I would probably pare that down to after his wife was killed by one of the king's noblemen, William Wallace began a quest to free Scotland from the tyranny and rule of the English king.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's dead on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Assistance of Robert the Bruce. I think that's funny. So how were you able to watch Braveheart? You said it was one of your favorites in high school. Is this one that you own?
I don't, and we'll probably get into it. I don't have a lot of Mel Gibson in my collection in general.
Yeah.
But I rented it on Amazon. I've seen it on Netflix a bunch of times, but we just had bad timing with this one, and it wasn't there. But $2 on Amazon.
Yeah, it's not available on any of the subscription streaming services in the U.S. right now. So you either have to own it or rent it. And luckily for me, my partner owns about a bajillion movies, and this happened to be one of them.
Oh,
so
good.
I didn't have to rent it. Mel Gibson.
Well, yeah, Mel Gibson. How familiar are you with like his movies, his acting career, directing stuff?
So I was really surprised by this when I went and looked it up. I have seen a surprising amount of Mel Gibson movies in my life. The earliest I've seen was 1993's The Man Without a Face, though I am like culturally aware of some earlier movies like Mad Max and Lethal Weapon, even though I haven't seen them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, he did this, like, rash of movies in the 90s, and I saw all of them. Pocahontas, Ransom, Conspiracy Theory, The Patriot, What Women Want, Signs. And, of course, he wrote and directed The Passion of the Christ, which is kind of where my Mel Gibson period ended, was with The Passion of the Christ. And then last year, I watched Hacksaw Ridge and later found out that Mel Gibson had directed that, which surprised me. So... yeah, there's a lot of Mel Gibson stuff in there, even though there is kind of like a clear line of delineation of before and after.
Right. Yeah, I've forgotten about Pocahontas, but yeah, he is the guy in that movie, isn't he?
Yeah, he plays John Smith.
Mm-hmm.
It's really weird whenever I see clips from Pocahontas now, and I'm like,
right.
That face does not match that voice. Okay.
Yep. And the Hacksaw Ridge was also like nominated for Oscars and stuff. It's kind of considered a part of his so-called comeback in Hollywood. So like those movies that you listed, I'm not seeing a lot of, like, I think of Braveheart as kind of like a war epic and a biopic, you know, like mashed together. Are those the kind of movies that you like usually enjoy, that you just sit down with some popcorn and like, let's watch a war epic?
Not generally, but sometimes. Movies like Hacksaw Ridge, Saving Private Ryan. I did really enjoy The Patriot. But I'm not often going to sit down and say, hey, this movie is about war. Let's watch it. Honestly, I think I watched The Patriot because Heath Ledger was in it.
I love that movie.
It had nothing to do with Mel Gibson.
Yeah, that movie is so good.
Yeah. Biopics I do tend to enjoy more because they're a story about a person's life, and I always find it interesting to learn about other people. So generally, yeah. And then this movie kind of combined them, so it was interesting. Yeah,
because we get the start with the little kid and go all the way to the end. So yeah,
the end. Yeah,
you get to see his life. So what did you expect about Braveheart? Like, speaking of the end, did you see that kind of thing coming?
Well, I really only knew 3 things about this movie going into it, which is impressive considering how old this movie is. I knew, 1, that Mel Gibson. 2, right. Mel Gibson in blue war paint shouting an inspirational speech while on a horse. And 3, Mel Gibson shouting freedom.
Yep.
That's all I knew. I had a vague possible awareness that he might die at the end, but I really didn't know because I didn't know the story of William Wallace at all. And the interesting thing is that none of those things are in the movie in the way that I expected them to be. I thought that the freedom bit was during the blue painted face inspirational speech, which I also thought was the climax of the movie. And so color me surprised when he's giving the speech and we're only halfway through.
Right.
It's a very, very long movie. So yeah, I knew nothing about this movie and everything I expected was wrong.
Sometimes it's nice to have your expectations thwarted, but sometimes that's an uncomfortable feeling. So did you enjoy watching Braveheart, like in light of that?
Oh, enjoy is just not the right word for a movie like this. I was moved by this movie, and I did become invested in the characters and the conflict, but I can't say that I enjoyed the pain and the torture and the death. But I am glad I watched it.
It's a real bummer ending. And
it was hard to watch, I have to say. So I put this movie in on Wednesday and had intended to watch it all on Wednesday night. And I kept trying to get my partner to watch it with me. And he kept saying, no, I don't want to watch that movie. No, I refuse to watch that movie. I don't want to watch it. And so I started watching it by myself, and I eventually coaxed him to come in and sit with me, and he was mostly on his phone the whole time. And I ended up, like, 30 minutes in, I had to turn it off for some reason, and I didn't get to finish it. So Thursday night, I turned it on again, and about halfway through, he did come back in and sit with me, and, he was telling me that he's seen this movie, like, a dozen times. And so I'm like, then I don't understand. Why don't you want to watch it? You obviously like this movie. And when the movie's over and I'm sitting there crying and I looked at him and I said, that was really hard to watch. He said, now I want you to think back to yesterday when I kept telling you I didn't want to watch this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, I kind of get that now. Super hard to watch.
Yeah. And if you think about, like, it's impossible for me to think about that ending, like, as I watched it this time without also thinking about the fact that he directed The Passion of the Christ. And I know you haven't seen Lethal Weapon, but also, like, in a bunch of the Lethal Weapon movies, his character is often, like, tortured and like violently tortured, and it can be graphic. Even though those movies are like buddy cop movies, there's some pretty, like, you're like, ugh, this is hard to watch. And he's interested as a storyteller in pain and torture. And I don't know if that's related to, like, his religious beliefs, as expressed in The Passion of the Christ, or if that's just something that he's interested in, like, the visceral kind of, in this case, literally, how movies force you to experience that body empathy as you watch it. As a storyteller, he seems interested in that somehow.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's probably a good time to talk about one of the things that I wanted to make sure we mentioned. Mm-hmm. I was intrigued watching this now that we are in a post Game of Thrones world, watching the violence in this movie, because there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of, like, I think probably for 1995, this was very, very, very gory and very, very dark.
Yes.
In a way that it's not quite now, because there really wasn't that much blood. Like, yeah, we saw him, like, literally cave somebody's skull in, but it was just for a split second. There was no gory blood all over the hammer or whatever. And, we saw all these dead bodies everywhere, but there really wasn't that much blood. And so that was an interesting thing to watch too, because I'm desensitized to a lot of that gore now because of shows like Game of Thrones and shows like Westworld, where the more blood, the better, and the more graphically you can show violence, the better. Mm-hmm. And so it was different kind of watching this with that desensitization, because at first I was like, oh, well, this isn't bad at all. And then the more I kept watching it, even though there wasn't blood, it was really hard to watch, especially the final scene. But even leading up to that, there were times, like, I physically reacted to what I was seeing on the screen, because you could hear things, or you would see, like, somebody have a sword, like, slicing from between their legs up, and you wouldn't see the blood, but just the visceral reaction to seeing that depth of violence and pain, it was rough.
Yeah, I remember seeing this as a teenager. Like, it must have been like a year after it came out. I didn't see this in the theater the first time, but I can remember after the wife dies and he goes in for his revenge against that, whoever the Lord is there. I think he cuts off a guy's leg as he's like, that's part of the opening gambit. And I remember, like, I gasped and, like, put my hands on my face because, like, the blood was splurting out and all this stuff. And I grew up on Kung Fu movies and, like, Friday the 13th and lots of scary, like Freddy Krueger and stuff like that. Like, I was no baby as far as seeing blood on a screen was, but it seemed realistic in a way, and just, like, gut punching at that time, like you said, in a pre-Game of Thrones world. And when he catches that Lord and he cuts his throat the same way that they did the girl, and you actually see the throat cut, not like they didn't show you with her, but they show you with him, and you watch the blood pour out. And I was like, oh my God, like, that was seared into my mind when I saw that as a young man. And yeah, the violence is at that time was really like a next level thing that I think really set the stage for some of the more hardcore scenes in Lord of the Rings, like when they're fighting the orcs and stuff, and on into Game of Thrones and Westworld. And those shows kind of owe a debt to The Sopranos and stuff. But definitely, I think Braveheart was a big part of turning up the volume in the 90s on what was acceptable in terms of violence.
Right.
And I think Mel Gibson was a big part of that. Like I said, I think he's interested in that kind of violence, you know? And I think that kind of segues into the problematics of Mel Gibson as a person and kind of the struggle, like you said, as a modern person, like watching this in a post Game of Thrones world. We're also watching this in a post Mel Gibson scandal world of like watching him on screen and thinking about the fact that he directed this and everything that means.
Yeah, we had questions from several of our listeners kind of asking us about this very issue. And I wanted to specifically point out one from our friend Kate. She's at I Do Human Things on Twitter. And she said, I am curious if it's possible to watch it at this point without constantly thinking about Mel Gibson as a person. Can these two podcasters separate the art from ass? So, Alan, can you just kind of give us a quick rundown of what the Mel Gibson controversy is?
Sure. So like back in 2006, Mel Gibson was caught speeding like 80 miles an hour in a 45 mile an hour zone. He had an open bottle of tequila. He was intoxicated. So like an extremely dangerous situation, both for him and like the people around him, which would be bad enough, but, you know, might be some Hollywood bad boy behavior. But as he was arrested, he cussed out the cops with a lot of like ethnic slurs. One of the police officers was a woman, and he was very sexist and denigrating to her specifically, like about her womanhood. And then after that, his girlfriend turned up at the time. His girlfriend turned up being beaten up and had recorded a lot of threatening conversations with him over the phone. He didn't know that he was being recorded, but she said that he knocked out her front teeth, and he said, "You deserved it." And then he went on to like threaten to put her in a rose garden. And like all this stuff is public record. Like you can look it up pretty easily and check up on it. So that, I mean, that's a death threat against his girlfriend. And he was constantly using like anti-Semitic remarks, the N-word, things like that in these recorded conversations, and has been known to say things like Jews control all the banks and entertainment system, which is a very anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that is toxic in a way that is, in my opinion, pure evil. So
basically, he's really just an all-around really terrible human being.
Yeah, he's, in my opinion, like irredeemable in terms of as an artist.
Yeah. So how do we separate the art from the artist in a case like this? I know this has come up a lot recently, you know, with people like Joss Whedon and other, I can't think of anybody else right off the top of my head, but I know that this is constantly something that fans have to kind of come to terms with.
Yeah.
So how was it for you watching Braveheart again after all of this? Because I can tell you from my perspective, I mean, there is a clear line. Like, The Passion of the Christ was the last Mel Gibson movie I watched, and that was in 2006. Because after all of this stuff came out, I mean, yes, his career kind of tanked a little bit after that. So there wasn't much happening until recently when he's kind of starting his comeback. But it was easy for me at that point to draw a line and say, you know, I don't want to watch anything that Mel Gibson does. But it was also really easy to hold to that because there wasn't really any new content.
Right.
And so when it came up and it was time to watch this movie, I felt like I had to watch it because it really is a classic. It's a cultural classic for the United States. This movie was huge. And like you said, you did not understand how I could not have seen it. So it was something that I really needed to do for the point of this show. And one of the first thoughts in my thought doc was, I would be so much more enamored with this movie if I didn't know the things I know now about Mel Gibson.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it was easy to watch it at the time when he was a leading man and you didn't know all this stuff, and to like believe in the virtue of William Wallace and not be thrown out. I did sink into the movie, like, to answer Kate's question. As I watched it, I was able to let go and not think about Mel Gibson, especially through the love story. I always fall for that love story every single time. I think it's really well done. And then the turn that creates, the energy that it gives the movie after. I mean, this movie's way too long, but it's like 45 minutes of that love story. And then the way that it ends, you're just like, God, go kill every Englishman. Go do it, dude. I'm into it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like, I've written about this on my blog. I had a whole thing, like you said, about Joss Whedon and how we have to be honest with ourselves about what the bad behavior means, and how we need to, as consumers, we have like a responsibility, but also the power to use our money to not support people who, like, Mel Gibson is very talented, but there are also very talented people who are not anti-Semitic, violent to women and stuff like that. And we can support them and not support him. And
yeah.
I believe that's what you have to do. And when you're critiquing things like this is a classic movie. I think it earned the awards that it got at the time. As long as you have this discussion and you're honest about, like, this is how I feel about the creator, I think it's fine to watch these things and think about them and have criticism, as long as you include in them and you don't just ignore the fact, you know, that these people have bad behavior and should not be rewarded for it.
Yeah. I also think I agree with what our friend Lonnie Diane Rich says, that sometimes we like to try to separate the art from the artist when the artist is problematic. But you need to remember that there are some pieces of art that have more than one artist. Like, yes, we like to call this a Mel Gibson movie, but Mel Gibson is not the only person who created this. He directed it and he started it and he made sure that it got made. He didn't write it. He didn't film it. He didn't edit it, you know, and like so many hundreds of other people acted in it as well. And so if you blacklist him, then you're also blacklisting all of those other people who are involved. And so I think it's easy to forget that that's a thing whenever you've got one person's face and name attached to a project, especially when problems arise like this. But I think if you can get to the point where you can recognize that the art is bigger than the artist, than who we're saying is the artist, then it becomes a little more palatable, and you realize that, you know, you're not supporting this one single person, you're supporting this whole community of people who made things happen, and they should not all be punished just because of something horrible that one really horrible person did.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really true when you're talking about a film. You know, like, film is such a collaboration, even though the director and the star have so much power in that field. Yeah, there are hundreds of people who are involved in the production of this and who contributed to it on creative levels, and like you said, the writers. And I said that it won a bunch of Academy Awards, and it also won for, like, cinematography, like you said, the people behind the camera, for editing, although I have a lot of, I don't think it should have won for that, but yeah,
I mean, it won for best makeup, and that was not obviously Mel Gibson doing that. So
no. Yeah, so I mean, if it's a book written by one person and self-published or something like that, I'd be like, yeah, forget it. Like, I'm not engaging.
Or if it's a painting that was painted by one person, when you can specifically say, yes, this is supporting just one really terrible human being, then you can choose not to support it. But when it's more than that, sometimes it's different.
Yep. And the cultural impact of this, like you said, I mean, this whole movie is like a meme in a lot of ways, like the freedom thing and all of that. So,
right.
Yep, it's unavoidable. But I think as long as you're honest about it, it's okay.
Right. Okay. Well, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's actually talk about the movie itself. Are there any like kind of big themes that stuck out to you? I mean, because there's a lot going on in this movie, and it is a very, very long. I mean, this is a 3-hour long movie from 1995, before 3-hour movies were a thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this movie really set the stage for that kind of stuff, right? Like I mentioned, Lord of the Rings, which actually went into production not too long after this, because if you think about it, they filmed all 3 of those movies at one time, and the first one like came out in 2001 or something like that. So I think the success of a 3-hour war epic was like really had New Line Studios and other places thinking like, oh, we could do really long action movies and win awards and make lots of money. We should do that.
Right.
Yeah. It's too long though. It really is too long. When I was watching this, I kept thinking about masculinity. And I think part of that was because of the Mel Gibson problem. And I feel like it has a lot to say kind of in response to things that came before it. You know, like the late 80s and early 90s were these male-dominated action movies, you know, like Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, those kind of movies where you had like a one-man wrecking crew, like a Superman of physical ability and fighting prowess who is also kind of a dummy. But it didn't matter because he didn't need to be smart. He was just so powerful and unstoppable. And this movie said, what if the action hero was really smart? Like that's a more virtuous way for men to be, and more inclusive way, to include like really smart men, which is also kind of nice because William Wallace is like this big national hero in Scotland. Of course, I think we know about him in America from this movie, but in Scotland, this movie did really, really well, which you would expect because he's kind of like the big national hero there. So to say like, oh, your big national hero was a badass and he was really smart, probably helped this movie out quite a bit. And early on in the movie, what got me thinking about this, the dad says to him,
"I know you can fight. But it's our wits that make us men."
And I think the whole movie is kind of about that. You see these really smart men like Longshanks. He's very shrewd, but he has no principles. Like he fires on his own men. He is willing to wholesale slaughter children and women and destroy entire towns to make his point. He's willing to like institute a policy of rape on a national scale to, win his war by eugenics. The guy is evil, but he's smart. And so smart's not good enough. You have to have noble, principles. You have to be willing to fight. You have to be good enough at the fighting. And so I think that's kind of like the picture of masculinity that the picture puts out there as virtuous. But there are lots of problems like hiding in the corners of this movie because of that. Like, for example, the queer prince is a stereotype of this like inadequate, emasculated man who he's villainized in the movie, but he's also like shown to be very ineffectual. He's not smart or badass or noble. And I feel like that's tied to his sexuality in a way that's really problematic.
Okay.
And then there's also like, in terms of masculinity, the women in this story pretty much only exist for the men. They're either objects of desire or pawns to motivate the men in the plot, or to like the French princess like exists to fall in love with William Wallace and then kind of stick it to Longshanks at the end in terms of like, your son couldn't even get me pregnant and I'm pregnant with your enemy's baby. Like that's the point of her, which is a big problem. There's, and then there's also like no people of color in this movie, which is super inaccurate to the time period and a big problem too. So, I mean, masculinity was on my mind when I watched the movie.
I think I tend to be a little bit more forgiving about things like this in movies like this, because it's a movie about a romanticized version of the 13th century written in 1995. And so is it problematic? Absolutely, it's problematic. But was it problematic in 1995? No. I mean, it was. We just didn't know it was.
Right.
If
yeah.
that makes sense. And so I tend to, I am probably more forgiving than I should be on things like that. And I feel certain that there have been movies that we've talked about even on this show where I have been completely unforgiving about things like that. And I don't know what the difference is to me unless it's just I ended up enjoying this movie and so I'm going to forgive it. And if I don't enjoy it, I'm not going to, which is probably a little more accurate than it should be. Wow, learning a lot about myself today.
I think there's something to be said for charm and for telling your story well. You know,
Yeah.
if you're doing a good job at it, it is easier to overlook those things. That's a really good point, though, of talking about the time that it was made. You can't interpret everything by today's standards when this movie is, what, like 20 years old or older? Yeah, we talked about that. We had Lonnie Diane Rich on our show that I do with Anya, and she pointed that out, and I always try to keep that in mind. We talked about Moonlighting, and she was like, hey, this was made in the 80s, and it's pretty good for when it was made, and what it really shows us is a snapshot of that time and place and the underlying assumptions of the storytellers, and it tells us something about ourselves then and tells us something about ourselves now. And I do try to keep that in mind when I do the criticism, you know, of stories. So it's really good to point that out. This tells us something about the 90s and it tells us something about now.
Yeah. And I wanted to point out, though, that I'm not sure that the movie was intentionally trying to say that, I don't think you use this word, but virtuous men are violent. Just because, with the exception of the very problematic prince, we didn't encounter any nonviolent men. The nobles, the non-nobles, the people we were rooting for, the people we were like rooting against, bar none, they were all extraordinarily violent, like murderous violent. And so I feel like that's more of a statement on, like you were talking about, masculinity than it is on virtue. Yeah,
that's a good point. That this is like an acceptable way for men to behave, probably even like a good way for men to behave, to be like these badass warriors. But it's also like the Middle Ages in the middle of a war. So yeah, everybody's going to be killing each other, and nobody's going to be saying we can't do this.
Yeah, I mean, because even the little boys at the beginning were violent. Like their playfulness was punching each other full on in the face.
Yeah.
Like, I was confused by that at first, and then I realized they were just playing. Like, who plays like that? Apparently, little boys in 13th century Scotland, according to this movie. So
I think it's trying to make out Highlanders to be badasses from the time that they're born, you know. And maybe that's a stereotype. I have no idea. I've never been outside of the United States, certainly not to Scotland. So,
yeah, my only frame of comparison is Outlander, which of course was 400 years later, but still takes place in the Scottish Highlands, and it's different. Yeah. I mean, William Wallace is no Jamie Frasier.
That should be on the back of the box.
Which box? Braveheart or Outlander?
It could be both.
I mean, I do accept, though, that I understand that this is a highly fictionalized and highly romanticized version of medieval Scotland. And so I try to kind of take what the movie says with a grain of salt.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking, though, especially like when we get to the end of that love story, about, because it works on me every time, like I said, you know, as many times as I've seen this movie. And it's been a lot of years since I've seen it. I think, like you said, since The Passion of the Christ, I might have seen this movie one time because I was like, I was stuck in a garage sale and I was like, what can I watch that's 3 hours long and will get me through this garage sale?
Okay.
Yeah, I was the person taking the money and nothing was happening. There were no customers.
Oh, no.
But I was thinking at the end of that love story is Murren, who I think that's how you say her name, Wallace's wife. Is she fridged? And, you know, for people who maybe don't know what fridged means, that means when a female character is killed to motivate a man, usually in a revenge plot. And we say that because there was this idea of like stuffing women's dead bodies into fridges. So we say fridged. Mm-hmm. But she feels like a full character to me by the time that she dies. And to me, like when a fridged character is someone who often doesn't have a name and has no agency or, you know, any characterization of any kind. And to me, Murren is a character. She chooses Wallace. I can see the mechanics of the plot. Like she's there to fall in love with him and to help us fall in love with him. But I don't know, like the whole thing's a story. Like, of course we're going to be manipulated. I don't know. Like, is she fridged? I can't decide.
Well, when I saw that you had this question, I had to sit and think about it. And it's a tough one because you're right. She did have agency. You know, I was cheering for her when the magistrate or whoever was trying to rape her and she like bit his cheek off. I was like, yes, like you do you, Murren. It was fantastic. But honestly, I think she was. I think she was fridged because if you look through my notes, and let me just tell you, I had 133 notes in this movie.
It's so good.
Because it is so long. Like I spent a fair amount of time at the beginning complaining about the love story that you enjoy so much because I went in expecting a movie about a war and got a good 40 to 45 minutes of a love story right off the bat. And I knew that this eventually moves into war. And so like my questions were, why are we watching this? Is she really going to be this important to the rest of the movie that we had to spend 45 minutes building up this relationship? And I thought it was taking up too much time and like this doesn't need to be here. And then all of a sudden it clicked in my head and I literally wrote down and suddenly I realized why we needed that love story.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Murren is a fictional character created solely to give Wallace a more relatable reason to go to war. The movie would have been far less interesting if Wallace went to war because of politics and politics alone the way he did in real life. I mean, yes, he did have a wife. Her name was Marion. She did die, but that was years before the rebellion started. It did not drive him to start this rebellion. It was in a revenge scenario. Murren was created solely to die to give the audience a more relatable reason to enjoy this war story. And because of that, I have to say, yes, I think she was fridged. Even though she was a well-written female character, mostly, who did have her own agency, they created her to kill her.
That's a great point. I don't think I realized that she was made up to, I don't know a lot about the actual history of this, which is weird because like usually that's the kind of stuff that I'm into. But yeah.
Well, I looked it up because when you were asking this question, I was like, well, this is based on a historical like story. Like William Wallace was real. So if his wife really was killed and that's what spurred him to go on, then obviously no, she wasn't fridged because we're just telling a story that happened. And so I was looking up, did he have a wife? Was she killed? Is this what really started his quest for freedom? And when I realized it wasn't, I felt like that was a pretty clear answer.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it puts me in mind of like the Iliad, where Helen of Troy is kidnapped, so to say, by Paris and from Sparta to Troy, and then all of Greece goes with war to Troy to rescue her, which is like Homer doing the exact same thing. He makes up Helen, damsels her in order to explain a war of aggression from Greece onto Troy to make it like, oh, this is a romantic thing, instead of this is wholesale slaughter of a city-state by all of the other city-states of Greece. Like it's kind of almost exactly the same thing. So all that to say, like, this is a very old trick of writers to fridge a woman to make us feel like, oh yeah, you blank check, man, go kill people.
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit more than that. I think it speaks a little bit to the human condition because it worked and you have said you really enjoy the love story. Like, the love story speaks to you. You kind of get immersed into it, and you're there as they're falling in love. And that's a thing that humans enjoy. You know, you get these feelings of serotonin and dopamine when you experience love, when you watch other people experience love. It's warm and fuzzy. And I found myself, when I was watching this movie, I felt like I was two people. Like, there were two people inside my head warring with each other when I was watching this movie. And kind of a little after halfway through, it stopped and I was just able to experience the movie. But I am a hopeless romantic. I am 9 times out of 10, I am always going to go for the, like, fairy tale love story princess thing. Like, I want a happily ever after. And so I loved the romance at the beginning. Like, the story was beautiful and it was sweet. And I wanted them to get together, and I was rooting for Wallace to win the war because of that love that started everything. But then I also had, like, the analytic part of me who's watching this, like, to criticize it so that we can talk about it on the show. And that part of me got frustrated with how long the movie was and how the story was written, because there are some problems there. But there is that part of me who just, I love the love story too. And I think that's why writers continue to do that sort of thing, because they know that it's going to, like, speak to people. Now, love stories don't have to end with fridging. Like, that's the piece that I hate. But the love story itself was good. It was nice.
They did a really good job with it. That flower, like, gets me every time when she gives it to him. And then when he gives it back to her, and I'm like, oh my God. And through the whole thing, he's got it probably has a name, like a Scottish name. I don't know what it is, but, like, the handkerchief that she sewed or whatever that keeps going from person to person and comes back to him at the end. And then he drops it and goes, like, oh my God. But it does kind of ruin the whole thing for me. And it always has with the French princess. I'm like, this is not okay. Like, do not kiss her. What are you doing? I hate that.
Oh, man, my notes for that, like, literally, I was typing, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex. And then my next line was all caps, no, no, no. I was so upset. I was like, he is spitting on the memory of Murren, who he's doing all of this for. And it was after that he has the conversation with Hamish, where Hamish is just like, you're just doing this because you think she's looking down on you. And he's like, well, I know she's looking down on me, just like your dad's looking down on you. And so he is still, like, calling her memory as what's spurring him on, even though he just had an affair with this other woman. Like, you can't do that in a good love story.
Yeah, that's the problem. Like, I could, you know, if it's real life, like, she died and, you know, life goes on and you fall in love with other people. But I don't know, like, it just feels wrong with how intense everything is. You're just like, that's kind of a bastard move. I mean, it's cool in the end, you know, when she's whispering into Longshank's ear about everything. You're like, ooh, yeah, die knowing that, you bastard. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I never like it. I've never liked it.
Yeah. Well, should I tell you the historical inaccuracy that was going on there? Because Princess Isabella was 3 years old in real life while this was happening. Oh my God.
I did not know that.
Yeah, she was only 3, so she had, like, no part in any of this. She was not yet married to the prince, like, nothing.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
All right. I thought you would enjoy that. Let's take a minute. I want to talk about the story itself, because honestly, even though this is a movie that you can really get into and you can really get emotionally invested into the characters, if you step back and kind of remove some of that emotion and you look at the skeleton of the story, I think it's really poorly written. I got frustrated because it leaves out so much information. Like, right after, like, I think even before we see the first battle, like the first serious battle, when just William Wallace and his merry band of men are, like, kind of roaming the countryside, and they've defeated some of the nobles. Like, rumors have spread so far and wide about him. Like, when he rides up and he says, "I'm William Wallace," and they're like, "You can't be. He's not tall enough. William Wallace is 7 feet tall. You know, William Wallace can, bound a mountain in one giant leap." We haven't seen anything that would lead us to believe that there is a good reason for there to be rumors like that spread. We're supposed to be involved and invested in supporting his greatness based on just the love and passion that we saw in that early love story. And that's supposed to carry us through the rest of the movie. And I wish they had actually shown his greatness. If he was really great enough to inspire all of those Scotsmen to follow him, then they should have at least shown us some of that so that it was believable. Because honestly, based on what we got in the movie, I have no idea what he did before that first big battle. Like, why were they following him? Why did rumors spread about his greatness and how ruthless and badass he was? We don't know. They didn't tell us.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it's totally informed, right? And I'm trying to think, like, how could you fix this problem? And I don't even think it would be that hard, because you have, like, those conversations between Robert the Bruce and his father, the leper, where he's talking about Wallace, and you could do, like, I'm imagining right now, like, that conversation and then kind of intercut it where he's talking about, like, oh, this Wallace, he fights for passion and all of this stuff, and intercut it with, like, some fighting scenes, and then maybe intercut that with some peasants talking about, did you hear Wallace defeated our Lord? And you're like, oh yeah, he struck him down with one blow. Oh, I heard he shot him with lightning bolts from his ass, or something like that.
Yes. All we needed was one good montage during one of Robert the Bruce's conversations with his father. That's all we needed. If they had just inserted that into the movie, it would have felt more believable. Now, I will say, they gave him some damn inspirational speeches, and so it worked well enough.
Oh, those speeches are great.
But I wish it was better.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we have to, I think it's even confusing, and I saw this in your notes, and I definitely felt it the first time I watched it. When you get to that battle scene and you're seeing the Scottish nobles that we've never seen before, and you're like, which side is this? And is he going to fight his own people? What is even happening? And it really takes that scene like a good 10 minutes to cohere in a way where you're like, oh, okay, I get it. This is that, this is that side. This is the other side. Yeah. And this is what's going on, because it's clear that, like, the Scottish nobles don't even intend to fight. They just want the men there so that they have a better negotiating position to get, more land or whatever for themselves. Right. Yeah. So it's not even clear what the dynamics of the scene are. And then once Wallace shows up, everything is informed, like you say. And so all of that is very rickety, and it's kind of only saved by Mel Gibson's charisma and the good writing of the speech. And James Horner's, like, excellent music kind of pushing everything up. But yeah, the actual writing and structure of the story is not good.
Yeah. Now, I totally, like, kind of get what they were going for. So when Randall Wallace kind of decided he wanted to tell the story of William Wallace, he took a lot of inspiration from an epic poem written by Blind Harry. I don't know who that is.
What? I don't either.
He was a 15th century kind of minstrel or poet, and he wrote this very long poet that I'm not going to read the name of the title because I don't think I can pronounce it, but it was more commonly known as the Wallace. It's a very epic poem that recounted the life of William Wallace, written almost 200 years after William Wallace died. And so it's very largely fictionalized, but there are lines in the poem that talk about those rumors and say things like he was 7 feet tall or he shot lightning out of whatever. So I get that he was, like, pulling inspiration from that, and he was deliberately trying to call back to that source material. But if he was going to do that, he should have given us more, is all I'm saying.
Now, let me ask you this, because we're both American and whatnot. If we were both Scottish and we were in Scotland, I wonder if this would even occur to you. Like, change the context of this and have it be about George Washington instead, and reference things that are famous about George Washington. And it would be like, well, everybody knows that. You grow up knowing that. Of course, everybody in the crowd knows it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's a good point. Like,
as a cultural hero, would we need to
inferred
see it?
knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess it would depend on who the intended audience for this movie was.
Yeah,
it did premiere in Scotland. Like, the world premiere was in Scotland.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that either. I don't know all this stuff. Yeah. You know way more about this movie than I do.
All I did was read the Wikipedia page.
Gotcha.
Well, several Wikipedia pages, actually. So I think, though, that if you're relying on cultural knowledge for your story to make sense, then you're not that great of a writer. I think I'm going to double down on that.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because even like I referenced the Iliad, and even in the Iliad, it takes time to tell you, even though these are the most famous heroes of all of, Greekdom, it takes time to spotlight each one of them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's how you write. And like I said, the scaffolding in this movie is not great for a lot of moments like that. And the battles run together a little bit. It's confusing. And I know, like, the little bit that I do know about the historical accuracy of this movie is that it's not very accurate. Like, some of the tactics and stuff are in the wrong battles. There are whole battles that are left out that were more important than the battles that were left in. And, yeah, all kinds of stuff didn't happen the way that they showed in the movie. And, you want to tell your story. You want to put your story first when you're writing a story, and even when you're adapting history. I don't think that you need to be a slave to it, but it seems like the writer just was doing his own thing and using William Wallace as kind of a glaze over the whole thing to tell a story that he was more interested in telling, and not doing a great job at even telling the story that he was interested in.
Right. But it was a beautiful movie to experience. And so I think the videographer, the cinematographer, the James Horner who did the score, I think they masterfully blended together all of the things that were in this story to give a compelling, moving story to the audience, which is why, probably on most people's first watch, they wouldn't even pick up on those things. Like, if I hadn't been watching it with my critic hat on, I don't think I would have noticed, because I was so into the story and so emotionally invested in William Wallace's story and wanting him to win. I don't think it would have occurred to me at all. And I don't think it has. Because I honestly haven't seen, in any of the criticisms that I've seen of this movie, I haven't seen anybody talk about the actual narrative. I've seen them talk about the historical inaccuracies. I've seen them talk about the homophobia. I've seen them talk about just Mel Gibson being a terrible person. But I haven't seen them talk about the narrative itself.
Yeah. And I think that, those parts where it's most shaky is also the parts where you get the most spectacle, because, this is kind of a time before CG special effects were ramped up to the level that they are. And so those armies, that's all a bunch of extras, and the camera shots are wide and huge, and those people come crashing together, and you get a few of those really big medieval battles in a way that had not been done since the filmic times of Spartacus and those other Sandals epics from that time. And I feel like, narratively speaking, those are the weakest parts of the movie. But it doesn't matter, because you're getting that great music, you're getting those huge epic shots, and you're getting the close-up duels of our main characters, and also that spectacle, like we said earlier, of the violence that was not normal in theaters at that time, all just kind of glazes over the weaknesses in the writing. And I would suspect also that in the script, I haven't read the script, but what's very common for things like this is to get to that point in the script, and then for it to simply say, have one blank page and say, they fight. And then,
Yeah.
Leave it up to the choreographers and stuff like that and not incorporate the action into the storytelling. And so that's a place where you can run into problems in action movies, narratively speaking. But like you said, I think it is a really well told story.
Okay, we have been talking about Braveheart for a really long time. So let's move into kind of our favorite performances, if there are favorite moments, lines. I feel like, you said this was one of your favorite movies in high school, so I think you probably have a few things to talk about here.
Oh, definitely. I really love James Cosmo. Speaking of Game of Thrones, he's like the leader of the guys up on the wall where Jon Snow goes in the first couple seasons. He plays Campbell, who's Hamish's dad. Just the tough old badass who he gets shot with an arrow and they're trying to help him and he slaps him away and breaks the arrow himself. And then nobody
continues to fight.
Yeah. Nobody wants to cauterize the wound, and then he knocks out the guy who does. I just love that dude. He gets his hand cut off and then kills the guy who cut off his hand, and he's unstoppable. He's so great. Hamish is great. I really love the music too. It's just, James Horner does an amazing job with. I feel like he gives the movie life and emotion in a way that if you take that score out, it just doesn't work, because there are long parts of this movie with no dialogue. Just close-ups of people's faces or action, and everything that we're feeling about the movie emanates from that music, and it's really beautiful.
Oh yeah, this is one of the best musical scores that I've heard. It was gorgeous, to the point where I was noticing music in places I wouldn't ordinarily notice it. And it's funny because now I have a Pixel 2 for my phone, and part of the Google OS that's in the Pixel 2 now is if the phone recognizes that there's music playing, if it can tell you what it is, it will display it on the screen. Even if the phone is asleep, at the very bottom, these little white words will pop up and it'll tell you the title and the artist of the song.
It's almost creepy.
And so with soundtracks, it actually has spoiled me a couple times. So I knew that Murren and William were going to get married because the song that started playing while they started their courtship was called The Secret Wedding.
Oh no.
And so it was the courtship of Murren, and then the very next song was The Secret Wedding, and it kept doing that all the way through. And I kept paying attention though, because the music kept drawing my attention because it is just beautiful. I don't really care what it's called. I don't care that it's related to Braveheart. I just want to listen to it.
It's really good. That reminds me of a famous music spoiler. A week before Star Wars The Phantom Menace came out, the soundtrack came out with named tracks just like that. And the final track on it is the death of Qui-Gon Jinn.
Oh,
and
no.
You're like, what? What are you doing?
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. The Secret Wedding. That's funny. I like that. Another thing that I think about when I watch this movie is the way that I saw it for the first time. I went to my girlfriend's house and watched it with her family. And because we never would have watched this in my house. I think we both grew up very conservative Christian households, and this movie would not have flown in my house. And I remember my eyes bugging out when they took the 2 VHS tapes to watch this movie at. And I was, what? How long is this movie? But it's so funny to think about VHS tapes. But when I watched it for the first time, they had all seen it already. And the oldest brother in the family kept pausing the movie over and over. And this is how I saw it the first time. And going frame by frame every time that there was a special effect or violence to show how they did the camera tricks to achieve the extreme violence. And so it'll be an actor will be there, and then the frame will pop and it will be a mannequin. And it's really obviously a mannequin when you have the frame frozen like that. And then whatever the battle damage is will already be there. And then the sword will like swing into the frame. But it's so fast, at normal speed, you'll never catch it. But that's all I can see now every single time I watch this movie. Whenever, that scene that you talked about where the guy's head gets smashed in when he's getting revenge on the Scottish lords for betraying him in the battle, and he's up there in the guy's bedroom on the horse. Like, that's a very dramatic moment, and the music like sells it, and the way that Mel Gibson looks like a grim badass and everything. But if you actually stop to logically think about what's happening, it's like, how did you get that horse up at the top of the tower into a guy's bedroom without waking him up? And then he woke up the moment you hit him in the face. And then his plan is to jump out of the tower. Why are there doors there? Into like a big lake that I don't understand why that's there either. But then if you watch that moment, and I'm totally like ruining this moment now for everybody, but if you watch that moment, it goes in like slow motion, Mel Gibson or the stunt double falling from that really high height into the water. And it does this shot from the door down, and you can see the horse land on its side and float in the water. And it's like, that's not a horse. That's not a horse. Horses don't do that. That's styrofoam. So
okay.
I enjoy.
I have to ask, how long did it take to watch this 3-hour movie when it kept getting paused?
It took all day. It was like a whole Saturday.
Yeah, if this was the first time you ever saw it, how on earth did you ever watch it again?
I'm weird though. Like, I kind of enjoy that memory. Looking back on it, it didn't ruin the movie. I think the movie was still so powerful for me in terms of that love story. I've said this many times, like, I am such a cheap date when it comes to stories. Like, I will just buy whatever you're selling. Like, I am so easily convinced by the worst storytelling. I was brought up on comic books and like, He-Man and Masters of the Universe. Like, I'm here for it. Like, tell me your bad story and I will believe you.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It sold me. But I do kind of like fondly remember my high school girlfriend and her weird family every time I watch this movie. And it's part of the experience for me.
Yeah, that's sweet.
What about you? Like, what are the lines that really stuck out for you? Because it's got some funny moments, right?
It does have some really funny moments. The insane Irish dude who joins his cause.
He's so good.
And, he asks, will I get to kill some Englishmen? And then there's a little skirmish. And, Mel Gibson is like, if you fight for me, you get to kill Englishmen. And the insane Irish dude is just like, excellent. I cracked up. I think I actually paused it so I could write that line down and get it right. And then the payoff of every time he kept saying Ireland was his island. Mm-hmm. At first you just think he's crazy. Like, this one dude, he's saying Ireland is his island. No, this is not a thing. And then he just kept saying it. And then at the end, when you realize the payoff is that all of these Irish conscriptionists who the king thinks are going to fight for him have totally just walked up and are like, hey, dude, what's up? Yeah, we're here to fight for you. Don't worry. It's cool. That was fantastic.
That's such a good moment.
And then I guess some of the more serious stuff, I think William Wallace, while he's in prison awaiting his torture, and he's talking to the princess and she's trying to get him to confess so that he can just die painlessly and very quickly. And, he just looks at her and he says, every man dies, not every man really lives. And I just think that is wonderful advice, like, for every person. There's a difference between being alive and living. And I like that this story took the time to remind us of that. And then, as much as I hate to say this, given the conversation that we've already had about Mel Gibson, his acting all the way through this was spot on. His accent was terrible, but I kind of understand that he did the best he could, especially with all of those long, inspiring speeches that he had to do, considering the studio forced him to take this part. But his facial expressions, his crazy, like, war cry faces when he's, like, charging at the other army when Robert the Bruce defeats him or betrays him, and he just like sinks to his knees, and you can see on his face how broken he is in that moment. It just, everything that he did, I thought was spectacular. He is really talented.
He is.
He's just awful person. Like,
right.
Like, I
It's
wish
infuriating.
that it wasn't him. It is. It's infuriating. How can somebody so talented be so awful? Like, I don't understand. But I have to give credit just for the acting, because it was moving, and it was good. It was good.
Yeah, he's great. And that's part of what sells that love story for me too, is like, man, I want somebody to look at me the way that Mel Gibson is looking at Murren, you know.
Yes.
The total adoration on his face. So is there anything else we need to talk about Braveheart?
I was doing some reading about Braveheart yesterday to kind of prepare for this, and I was absolutely shocked and astounded to learn that in February of this year, a freaking sequel to Braveheart was announced.
Oh,
Have you heard about this?
I've heard there's a thing called After Braveheart, isn't there?
I don't know.
Maybe that's
I
not
did
what you're talking
come
about.
across that. No, they're doing a sequel about Robert the Bruce, about his life after he became king, and how I wish I had this in front of me right now, but it's about how his wife or some woman in the court or something has to save him. And the actor who played Robert the Bruce in Braveheart is reprising the role for the sequel.
Oh, yeah. Angus McFadden. Yeah. He's really good.
Yeah. He is really good. I struggled with the character of Robert the Bruce because I was really enjoying the actor. And he did come to a point of repentance at the end. Like, he kind of got redeemed. But, oh my gosh, I hated Robert the Bruce through most of the movie. But it would be interesting because Mel Gibson's not attached to the sequel at all. And so I'm curious about it. I really am.
Wow. So they're setting it. That's interesting to set it in the same timeline if you're going to use the same actor reprising a role. Yeah.
Yeah, because, Robert the Bruce did become King of Scotland. And so they're going to go forward just a little bit, and it's going to be set during that reign.
I'd watch that.
I think I would watch it too.
I looked up that After Braveheart is a documentary. That's what it is.
Okay.
Not worth watching. Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad that you told me about that.
Okay, there's one other thing that I want to ask you. This is a thing, Matthew and I have kind of started doing this. Like, Matthew and Mandi make a movie better.
Okay.
And we had a question on Facebook from Drew Hallam, and he asked, what is the worst part that you'd remove from the movie? So what would you change in Braveheart? Because we both think it's way too long.
Yeah.
So what are there things that we could take out and still preserve the integrity of the movie and make it better?
I really think that you could remove the entire succession subplot with the prince and his marriage to the French princess and like everything related to that. You really don't need it, because this is a story about William Wallace versus Longshanks. Like, in the protagonist-antagonist sense. I think that would save you a lot of time right there, and it would also remove that part that we both don't like, where it messes up the romantic, like motivation of his war. And that would probably save you a good 30 minutes of stuff right there, I think. Yeah. At least.
I agree with you. I also think I would probably take out most of the interactions between Robert the Bruce and his father.
Mm-hmm. It's weird that Robert the Bruce is like the only three-dimensional supporting character in the entire movie. And I don't know why.
But every single one of those interactions was essentially the same. Robert the Bruce saying, William Wallace is passionate and I want to be more like him. His father saying, no, you can't be more like him if you want to be king, and you have to be king, so you need to betray him. Like, that went back and forth, back and forth. Like, God, how many times did we see a scene with them? Like 5 or 6 times?
Yeah, it's more than 3.
Yeah, we didn't need that many. When we still could have had the betrayal, we still could have had the second betrayal at the end that was the father doing it and not Robert the Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't need the redundancy every time. Like, they kind of hit us over the head with this leper father is evil.
Definitely.
We didn't need it. And so I think we could have cut out some of that. And if we had cut out that the prince subplot, we probably could have gotten this movie down to a solid 2 hours.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about how those scenes just repeat themselves. I do like the part in that where he says, "My hate dies with you." And you could probably keep the first one and that one and still get the point across. Yeah.
Yep.
That's great. Yeah, you should be an editor.
No, because I usually can't do this.
Oh,
Usually
yeah.
I'm like, well, I didn't like the movie, but I don't know how to make it better. That happens to me a lot.
This movie's way too long.
Yeah, this one I had some very definite opinions about. So, well, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can use the hashtag PCDeprived on Twitter. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Eloquent Gushing. You can also email us at podcast@eloquentgushing.com. You can find each of us on Twitter. I'm at Mandi Kaye.
And I'm at Chipper Allen. You can check out my podcast with my co-host Anya. It's called Hallowed Ground Storycast, wherever podcasts can be found. If you like Braveheart, I would say check out our episode about Kingdom of Heaven. It's got some of the same actors in it, and also people with leprosy and the Middle Ages and epic war battles. It's very similar.
Okay.
We discuss stories on Hallowed Ground Storycast that changed our lives and the lives of our guests. Mandi was on there, which was great. And we also have a podcast that's about the Starz adaptation of American Gods called Shadows and Shamblers.
Yes, if you like that show, then you definitely need to be listening to Alan and Anya talk about it. It's fantastic. So Pop Culturally Deprived is 100% funded by listeners like you through our Patreon page. So any amount that you can give will give you access to exclusive content while also helping us do more and develop more shows. To find out more, you can visit patreon.com/eloquentgushing. If you like what we do, please don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, and please subscribe to our show. If you want to keep up to date, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can find the link to that on our homepage at eloquentgushing.com. Matthew and I will be back next week with another episode where we'll talk about The Dark Crystal with Amanda from the Wine and Three Quarters podcast. Until next time, I'm Mandi Kaye.
And I'm ready to present myself before this army, put my head between my legs, and kiss my own arse.
Pop Culturally Deprived is an Eloquent Gushing production. For more information, visit eloquentgushing.com or find us on Twitter at Eloquent Gushing.